The afternoon I realized a single sentence could cost me everything. The red-on-air light above the studio door was already glowing, and a stack of vinyl records sat warm beneath my palm like they were waiting for me to decide what kind of man I was going to be. Back then it was 1968, and the station was called WJRV, just 3 letters and a river town's heartbeat humming through an AM transmitter bolted to a steel tower out past the fairgrounds. If you drove along Route 30 in the evening you could see the tower blinking red against the clouds like a patient lighthouse, sending our little signal across western Pennsylvania cornfields and church steeples and the black ribbon of the Allegheny. I was 26 years old and proud of the simplest job a young man could have, spinning records and talking to neighbors through a microphone. People imagine radio men as big voices and slick hair and city lights. Our studio sat above a hardware store that smelled like rope and fertilizer. The carpet was worn thin under the control board, and the desk had cigarette burns from announcers long gone before me. The microphone cord coiled across the surface like a sleeping snake, and when the transmitter warmed up you could hear a faint electric hum through the headphones, steady as breathing. I loved that hum. It meant somebody out there was listening. Every weekday afternoon I walked up those narrow stairs, hung my coat on the same nail by the door, and slipped a stack of records from their paper sleeves. The sleeves had soft corners from years of use, and they made that whispery shuffling sound when you slid the vinyl free. "Good afternoon, River Valley," I'd say into the mic, voice bright as a kitchen window in spring. "This is Tom Callahan keeping you company till supper time." Then the music would start. The Beatles if I felt bold. Johnny Cash if the clouds were low. Sometimes a little Glen Campbell drifting over the static while folks drove home from the plant or stirred soup on stovetops. Between songs I read the town the way a barber reads faces. Lost Dog on Maple Street. Pancake Breakfast at St. Michael's. Congratulations to the high school marching band for winning second place in Greensburg. Little things. But in a town our size, little things were everything. The chemical plant sat 2 miles upriver, a gray maze of pipes and stacks that breathed day and night. If the wind came from the north you could smell it, a sharp, bitter sweetness that clung to the back of your throat like medicine. Most of the town worked there. My father had worked there until a valve burst one winter and the steam burned his hands so bad he couldn't close them right anymore. My brother worked there in maintenance. Half the men in my bowling league wore the plant logo stitched on their jackets. They sponsored our station, too. Every hour on the hour I read the same cheerful advertisement. River Valley thanks Hartwell Chemical for supporting local broadcasting. I could practically say it in my sleep. Truth is, none of us thought much about the smoke or the smell. That plant paid mortgages and bought school shoes. It kept the diner open and the church roof patched. You don't question the thing that feeds your town. Not until the river started acting strange. The Allegheny had always been muddy brown, especially after rain, but around that summer fishermen started bringing in smallmouth bass with pale sores along their bellies. The old men who fished by the railroad bridge talked about it first, leaning on their tackle boxes and spitting tobacco into the weeds. "Water's wrong," one of them told me while I was buying coffee at Miller's Diner. Miller's coffee came in thick white mugs that never seemed to empty because the waitress, Doris, hair like a steel helmet, refilled them before you could even ask. "What do you mean wrong?" I said. He shrugged. "Fish know things." I didn't think much of it then. Towns run on rumors the way radios run on electricity. But a few weeks later a man named Earl Dugan came up the station stairs carrying a cardboard box. Earl had worked in maintenance at Hartwell Chemical for 20 years. He smelled faintly of machine oil and peppermint gum. "I need you to look at something," he said. He set the box on my desk right beside the control board. Inside were papers. Lab reports, water samples, typed memos with official stamps in blue ink. I remember the way the afternoon lights slanted through the studio window and lit the dust in the air while I read. Numbers at first. Chemical names I couldn't pronounce. But then a sentence circled in red pen. Discharge levels exceeding recommended environmental thresholds. Another memo. Do not release findings publicly until internal review completed. Earl watched my face the way a man watches a weather forecast before harvest. They're dumping it upstream at night, he said quietly. Been doing it for months. Outside the window the river moved past town like it always had, wide and brown and steady. Why bring this to me? I asked. He looked at the microphone. Because people listen to you. That sentence landed heavier than the whole box of papers. Radio sounds small when you describe it, a man talking in a room. But the truth is that voice slides into kitchens and truck cabs and hospital waiting rooms. It sits on countertops beside coffee mugs. It floats through open windows on summer evenings. It becomes part of people's days. I told Earl I'd think about it. He nodded, though his eyes said thinking might not be enough. After he left I put a record on the turntable, The Righteous Brothers, I think, and tried to run the show like normal. But the studio felt different. The microphone stared at me. That evening when my shift ended I walked home along the brick sidewalks while autumn leaves skittered across the pavement like dry paper. Smoke from the plant drifted low over the riverbank, turning the sunset a sick orange. At home my wife Margaret was standing at the stove stirring chili. She always listened to the last half hour of my show while she cooked. Said it made the house feel less empty. How was work? She asked. I set the box of papers on the kitchen table. She wiped her hands on a towel and read the top report slowly. Margaret had a way of reading things carefully, like she was turning each word over to see if it had another side. What does it mean? She asked. It means they're poisoning the river, I said. The kitchen clock ticked louder than usual. And you're thinking of saying something. It wasn't a question. I nodded. Margaret sat down at the table. Our apartment was small, 2 rooms above a tailor shop, but that night it felt even smaller. Tom, she said gently, that plant sponsors your station. I know. And half the town works there. I know. And if the station loses that money. I know. She didn't say the last part, but it hung in the air between us like a note that wouldn't resolve. You could lose your job. I went to bed that night listening to the distant hum of trucks on Route 30 and the quiet hiss of wind against the window screen. Sleep didn't come easy. The next morning the station manager called me into his office. Frank Rizzo was a round man with suspenders and a desk full of ashtrays. He kept the blinds half closed so the room always looked like late afternoon. He tapped the box of papers with 2 fingers. Someone says you've been asking questions, he said. I didn't bother pretending. These are real reports, Frank. He sighed the way men sigh when trouble shows up wearing a familiar face. Tom, listen to me carefully. Hartwell Chemical pays nearly 40% of our advertising. That doesn't make the river clean. It keeps this station alive. Outside his office the transmitter hummed through the wall. Frank leaned forward. People don't want their afternoon music interrupted by panic. They want weather reports and ball scores and a little Sinatra while they drive home. What if their drinking water isn't safe? He rubbed his forehead. Then the county will deal with it eventually. Quietly. The word quietly settled into the room like dust. Do not bring this up on air, he said. That afternoon I sat at the control board with the headphones resting crooked on my head. The records were stacked the same as always. The microphone waited. And somewhere upriver, a pipe might have been spilling something invisible into the water that filled every coffee pot and bathtub in town. The on-air light flicked on. My voice came through the speakers warm and steady. Good afternoon, River Valley. I played 3 songs in a row before my hands stopped shaking. Between records I looked at the stack of papers Earl had left and then at the framed photograph of the station tower sitting on my desk. Outside, rain had started tapping softly against the studio window. I could picture the river swelling dark under that rain, carrying whatever the plant poured into it straight past town. My finger hovered above the microphone switch. In that quiet little room above the hardware store, with AM static whispering in my headphones and the smell of warm vinyl in the air, I understood something I hadn't known when I first sat behind that microphone. A friendly voice can keep a town comfortable. But sometimes comfort is just another word for silence. The song on the turntable faded into its final soft chord. The red light stayed on. And I took a breath. My finger hovered above the microphone switch while the last chord faded out into a thin ribbon of AM static, and for a moment the whole town seemed to hold its breath with me. You learn a peculiar thing working in radio: silence has weight. Not the empty kind that fills a quiet room at night, but the kind that lives inside a broadcast pause, the few seconds where listeners lean closer to their kitchen radios because something in the air feels different. That was the silence sitting in the studio that afternoon. Rain tapped softly against the window beside the record shelves. The smell of warm dust and spinning vinyl hung in the air. Somewhere downstairs a hammer clinked faintly in the hardware store. And in my headphones the transmitter hummed like a living thing waiting to hear what I would do. My heart was beating hard enough I could feel it in my throat. I thought about Frank sitting in his office with the blinds half shut. I thought about Margaret reading those reports at the kitchen table. I thought about the plant, those tall stacks breathing gray smoke into the sky like they had my whole life. Most of all I thought about the river. Every house in town drew its water from it. The same river where boys skipped stones after school and men cast fishing lines under the railroad bridge. The same river my father used to point at when I was little and say, "That water's older than all of us." The record needle reached the center groove and began its slow repeating click. I reached forward and lifted the tone arm. The studio went quiet. I leaned toward the microphone. My voice, when it came, sounded calmer than I felt. "Folks," I said, "I'm going to take a moment here to talk about something that's been brought to my attention." I paused. You could hear the rain through the window and the faint electrical buzz of the board. I've received several reports concerning chemical discharge into the Allegheny upstream from town. According to these documents, waste from Hartwell Chemical may have been entering the river in amounts higher than what environmental guidelines recommend. Even now, all these decades later, I remember the strange steadiness in my hands as I spoke. Fear can make a man shake. But once you step over the line where fear lives, something else takes its place, something quieter. I'm not here to tell anyone what conclusions to draw, I continued. But the river is where our drinking water comes from, and it's where our children fish and swim in the summer. So it seems to me that the people of River Valley deserve to know what questions are being asked. The words felt plain and simple as stones. No accusations. Just truth. I encourage town officials to look into the matter carefully and transparently, I said. And I encourage anyone with information to bring it forward. Outside, the rain grew heavier. I sat there for a second after finishing, the microphone still warm near my mouth. Then I cleared my throat gently. "All right," I said. "Let's get back to the music." I set another record on the turntable. Simon and Garfunkel this time. The needle dropped, and the soft guitar filled the room. But the air in that studio had changed forever. The phone started ringing before the first verse ended. The station's phone had a heavy black receiver that clattered loudly when you picked it up. I let it ring twice before answering. "WJRV," I said. For a moment there was nothing but breathing on the line. Then a voice. "You shouldn't have done that." Click. The next call came 30 seconds later. A woman's voice this time. "Is that really true?" she asked quietly. I reported what I was given, I said. There was a pause. "My kids drink that water," she said. Another click. The phone rang again. And again. Some callers thanked me. Some cursed. One man shouted so loud I had to hold the receiver away from my ear. "You're trying to shut down the only thing keeping this town alive." I didn't argue with anyone. I just listened. By the time my shift ended 2 hours later, the station manager's office door was already open. Frank stood there waiting. He didn't yell. Somehow that made it worse. "Tom," he said tiredly, "come in." The blinds were still half closed. The ashtray on his desk was overflowing. "You understand what you've done. I reported information people deserve to know. You blindsided the biggest sponsor we have. They blindsided the river." Frank leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "I liked your show," he said quietly. The past tense landed like a brick. "You're suspending me?" I asked. "I'm firing you." There it was. Plain as daylight. "Effective immediately," he added. "Station can't risk the backlash." He slid an envelope across the desk with my final paycheck. "Tom. I hope you understand." I picked up the envelope but didn't open it. "I do," I said. Outside the rain had stopped, leaving the streets shiny and dark under the streetlights. I walked home slowly with my coat collar turned up against the damp air. Margaret was sitting on the couch when I came in. The radio was on. Not my station anymore. She looked up at my face and knew. "They fired you." I nodded. She stood and wrapped her arms around me. We didn't say anything for a long time. Money got tight after that. There's no poetic way to describe it. I took odd jobs. Loading lumber. Delivering appliances. Reading late-night news at a small station 2 counties over for barely enough pay to cover groceries. Margaret picked up extra shifts at the tailor shop downstairs. Sometimes we lay awake listening to trucks roll past on the highway, both of us doing quiet arithmetic in our heads. Rent. Electric. Food. But the town had changed too. Some people crossed the street when they saw me. My old bowling partner wouldn't meet my eyes at the diner. Once, a man at the gas station muttered, "Troublemaker," under his breath. But other things happened too. A few weeks after the broadcast, the county announced an investigation into Hartwell Chemicals' waste disposal practices. Then state inspectors showed up. Then newspaper reporters. Months passed. One cold morning that winter the plant announced it would install new filtration systems and halt certain discharge processes until further notice. No one ever officially credited the radio broadcast. Things like that rarely get neat endings. But the river changed slowly. The fishermen by the railroad bridge started bringing in cleaner catches again the following spring. Years drifted by the way years always do. The station eventually hired a new afternoon host with a bigger laugh than mine and a smoother voice. Life kept moving. Margaret and I stayed in town. Worked. Paid bills. Raised a son who grew up thinking old radios were magical machines. Every once in a while someone would stop me in the grocery store and say something quiet. "My kids swim in the river now." Or, "Thank you for speaking up." Those words never came with applause. Just small nods and half smiles. And that was enough. Now I'm an old man sitting in a chair beside a radio that glows softly in the dark. The plastic dial light hums the same way those old transmitters used to. Late at night I still turn it on and listen to distant voices drifting through the static, some kid somewhere spinning records and talking to people he can't see. I wonder if he knows how far a voice can travel. Not in miles. But in the quiet places where people decide what kind of world they're willing to live in. The funny thing is, I was never a brave man. I was just a young announcer in a small room with rain on the windows and a microphone in front of him. But sometimes that's all it takes. A steady voice. A quiet room. And a single sentence spoken when silence would have been easier. Because applause fades. Anger fades too. But truth, spoken calmly, without shouting, has a way of moving through the world like a river. Slow. Steady. And farther than you ever imagine.